Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Most Segregated Hour. I am your host, Pastor Thorin Pankey. If you're wondering where Pastor Michael is, so am I. He's not here right now, but we have an excellent episode for you today with two of our very special missionaries, Rob and Danae Reynolds, all the way from New Zealand. How are you guys doing today?
Yeah, good.
So really
I'm doing
good.
really
Really good.
well. Yeah.
Thank you. It is so awesome to have you guys on here. I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have.
Mm.
And like I said, people from home, if you've been around KCC in the last couple weeks, you've probably seen these two around. Hopefully you have, but if you haven't, you're seeing them now. They are here all the way from the mystical land of New Zealand. So that's what we're going to talk about. So you two, please tell us just a little bit about yourselves, about your family, and then we'll get into asking about, your work and what exactly you're doing in New Zealand.
Sounds good. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we're Rob and Danae, as he has said, and we are from this KCC. KCC was our home church for many years. So we're from New Hampshire, from New England. That's where family is. But we were here in Michigan because of school, graduates of Calvin College, and then first jobs, first ministry. And it all started at KCC. So this is very much like coming home to us. But after some different positions at church here at KCC, churches out in New Hampshire, God called us to New Zealand, which we'll tell you about in a little bit. We have two boys, Caleb and Aiden. They both went to New Zealand with us, but that was 13 years ago. So in 2010 is when we went to New Zealand. And the boys are both still there. So Caleb is getting his master's in ocean research. And Aiden, our youngest, is in another city, but in New Zealand from us. And he's in Wellington, and he is studying film studies at Victoria University. And we have a dog and a
Mm,
cat too. So
mm. Yeah. So we lived out on the East Coast for 17 years before university,
yeah.
and then came out here to West Michigan and lived here 17 years. So this is kind of a second home.
Mm,
And as Danae said, we're on 13 years in New Zealand. We only thought we were going to be there for a year or two. So
yeah.
yeah, we're rapidly approaching that kind of magic 17-year mark of a third home.
Nice.
Yeah.
So,
So you thought you'd only be in New Zealand for a year. God clearly had other plans. So that is awesome to hear. So tell us a little bit about what you do in New Zealand, where you are,
mhm.
people group, that you work with, if relevant, mission organization, all that stuff.
Mm,
Awesome. Awesome. Yep. So we were originally drawn to New Zealand to work with the local church in Auckland. We went through global partners,
yeah.
and God's had us just on this wild path. Where we are now, I am the director for SIM New Zealand. So SIM started about 130 years ago as Sudan Interior Mission in Africa. Then in the 80s, a number of other agencies merged into to SIM, and that Sudan name of a region wasn't applicable anymore, so it became eventually serving in mission.
Mm,
And I direct one of our offices. We work with the local church in New Zealand. We work with individuals in New Zealand to provide pathways and to care for people that are called to cross cultural work. So if you think of it, we are the cheerleader for missions within the New Zealand church, or one of the cheerleaders, and just trying to ensure that mission doesn't become just one extra thing that the church does, but it's a central principle of the church. And then we are the logistics and care people for people that are on the front lines and doing the hard yards,
mhm,
serving all over the
mhm.
world.
Yeah, and I get the privilege to be a part of all of it as well. So I wear a couple of different hats. One is I'm Rob's PA, so keeping him organized, which is a mission in and of itself. And then the other hat I wear is I'm actually part of the personnel team, and I get the privilege of looking after all of our training efforts. So when we send missionaries out, they need to go through orientation and training and cross cultural training. So I look after all the training needs for Sim New Zealand. The awesome thing though is that Sim is global. And so we are the Sim New Zealand entity, but there's entities all over the world. And so we also wear a hat that we get to interact with Sim global. So there are just projects we're involved in, or there's like a leadership mentoring program that we're a part of. But we get to rub shoulders with Sim International as well. which is, yeah, just amazing to me that we just get, yeah, that we get to do what we do.
Yeah.
That is super cool. So it sounds to me like you guys are missionaries, but you're like the support for the missionaries, the people who mobilize the missionaries, the people who are maybe above the groundwork missionaries, and kind of direct them and support them, and work with the local churches as well. Correct?
Yeah, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
fair to say.
I think a great analogy. I was talking with someone else this week, and we were talking about the testimony of Keith Drury's life and his mindset of being a Samuel and not a David leader. That's probably a really good fit for where we are as well. You know, Samuel was the
Mm,
one that saw other people, saw what God wanted to do with other people, and was that voice of encouragement, that anointing on people. And we find ourselves in those roles.
mm,
I don't
mm,
want to say that we are anointing people. That seems like a fairly arrogant thing to go ahead and say. Um,
mm,
but that voice of encouragement, that seeing what the church can be and trying to inspire or call
mm,
the local church into that space. When people are starting to feel a call, seeing what God can do
mhm,
with that call as well, and be able to speak a vision of the future into them,
mhm,
you know. and
mhm,
and so Samuel was just important as a David. Samuel was just behind the scenes, and that's
mm.
the leadership role that we get to play.
Yeah, and that comment of coming alongside churches, it is about helping them send their people, because that's where the mobilization comes from, is from the local church. But it is also stepping into that vision, as Rob said, that it's helping the local churches, which is why this has been such a great match with KCC, of understanding their missional footprint both locally and globally, and especially coming out of COVID, that has just been a great need of, yeah, just help the churches desiring to understand what does it mean to be missions, what does it mean to be missional, and so we get to have a voice in that as well, which is a real privilege.
Mm,
Absolutely. And I love what you said about that. I love what you said earlier about how, like, making sure the church understands that missions isn't just like some little thing we do, but it's like the main thing that we need to be
Mhm.
doing. And that is, of course, something, listeners at home, if you've been to KCC, Pastor Mick he's going to be reminding us of that pretty much every week, and everything that we're starting with Immigrant Connection and all the
Yeah.
missionaries and doing this podcast right now. So that is
mm,
excellent. So thank you. I just think it's really cool. My mentor, one of my spiritual mentors while I was in my undergraduate, who I still am in communication with, he is an SIM missionary as well.
No
Retired
way.
now, but still does a lot of work. He in Benin, Africa,
Yeah.
and
okay.
served in that capacity for more than 30 years. And
Wow.
interestingly,
Wow.
he mentioned to me that because he told me lots of stories, and his portfolio, his body of work is very similar to what you guys just described. So, the
Yeah.
moment I heard you
Okay.
guys are SIM missionaries, I was like, nice connection.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, that's great.
so before we get into like kind of the more nitty gritty details about what you guys
Mm.
do, could you share just a little bit about how God called you into the mission field? You already shared a little bit about this, but maybe go into a little more detail, because you were here at
Oh,
KCC, and then you were in ministry, and
Yeah.
then God was like, "Well, you're going to go to New Zealand," and you're like, "Okay,
yeah,
what
yeah.
exactly was that journey like?"
So are we 2
That's a
hours or what are we?
Yeah. So
Give me
so
give
we'll
me the 5-minute version if possible.
Okay.
Sure, sure. I'll try to give you the 2-minute version because Danae
There we
has her
go.
own 2-minute version.
Great.
So
Yeah.
for me, I always had a heart for mission, but I put barriers in place. So, you know, I can remember being a teenager and wanting to go and do short-term mission trips, but I'd see the price tag on the trips and I'd just assume I couldn't do it. Um, but there was always this seed in the back of my head that was just like, man, I would love to be able to do that, and it never really went away. When I was 28, I went on my first missions trip. It was a trip through KCC. We partnered with another church here in Grand Rapids and took 52 seventh and eighth graders to Juarez, Mexico. We also brought back 52 seventh and eighth graders from Juarez, Mexico. So it was a win.
Phew.
Um, and um, and it was that trip that I thought at that time that I was going to be a lifelong youth pastor. I was working under Mark Carroll, another great role model in youth ministry, and you know, here was
Mm,
someone that served lifelong, and I thought, well, maybe I could be like Mark. Um, and but that mission desire was still there, and so I just started praying that God would give me a heart for one region of the world. And in my mind, that would work out with me taking my youth group kids to the same place and building a long-term relationship.
Mm, mm,
Um, and it was one of those prayers that gets stored in the back of your head, and you think that like it comes up every once in a while, but it's not like on your day-to-day prayer list that you go ahead and sing your pray all the time. It's just there and it's present. In 2004, we were asked to take a team. So at the time, I was leading the Never the Same planning team, and we were asked to take a team over to New Zealand and help them start a youth camp. And I just thought this would be a great adventure. I've never been that far before. They were only asking for 1 week a year for 3 years. I'm like, that's an easy commitment to make.
it was the
Um,
Wesleyan
and
denomination, and
yeah,
mm,
yeah, and just a way to feed into what God is doing. And so I thought, okay, we'll
mm,
go ahead and do that. And I remember getting back on the plane after that, with this like light bulb moment that, okay, God, I think this is how you're answering this prayer. I spent a week in New Zealand. I got to see how what the culture was like. It's very much a post-Christian culture. You can't
mhm,
assume that people know the stories that we take for granted in the Bible. It's a space where the church has to be innovative and trying to reintroduce itself to culture. You're getting in these regular conversations with people, and I love that space. And I thought, okay, well,
mm,
God, I think you're going to have us. Well, not more. I know you're going to have us back here in New Zealand. Um,
mm,
I was coming back, and Danae was 6 weeks away from having our second child,
mhm,
and we were about to move closer to family for a ministry role out east.
mhm.
Another thing that we had been praying for, and I was just wise enough to know that that's not the time you tell your wife you're going to move halfway around the world. I didn't quite understand what was going on, and so we
Mm,
just let it sit. And then God created an
mm,
opportunity for us to go again. And at this time,
mm,
again, we thought that we were going to New Zealand for a year or two. We're going to work with this church. I thought
mhm,
that New Zealand was 10, 15 years ahead of where the church in the US was going. And it would be a primer to come back here and then, understand how we needed to do ministry here. But God's just
yeah,
never let us go.
yeah, that's
So
the
your
truth.
your story today,
Yeah,
because yours is a little different.
I just followed Rob, no.
Yeah.
Surely not.
God is patient and God is good, and it has been it was a slow drip for me is how we describe it. My passion and heartbeat, and it still is for the local church. So this was the girl who was never leaving US soil. I love to travel, and it was very open to like mission short-term trips and things like that, but never was I going to go somewhere and whatnot. So the journey that Rob shared, and we ended up out in New Hampshire. I knew the heartbeat that he had for New Zealand, but I just thought it might be somewhere nice we go serve for a few months or something at some point. But God just kept working on my heart, and we had life circumstances put us in a position of what next, God, and that wasn't an easy what next. That was a stripping it away and layers of the onion being taken away and grappling with what I felt we wanted. And we wanted to do camp ministry or a local church ministry or whatever it might be. But God, I believe, speaks to us in it three ways. There's probably lots of ways, but in to generalize them, God speaks through his word. Obviously, he speaks through his word. He speaks through circumstances, and he speaks through people around you, and and pay attention to that. And that's where, yeah, God used all of those ways to just keep, like I said, taking away the layers of the onion and the right people at the right time, and opening my heart and just coming to that place of realizing it wasn't about being called into missions per se, although now I see how it all fits together. It was being called to New Zealand. And so yeah, so there was an opportunity in front of us with global partners, and yeah, we just started to step into it. But even that was a slow process. How we stepped in, raising the support to go, that stuff. But God, I think, knew that I needed the time. So
It
yeah,
was actually it,
mm,
it was fascinating how it worked because when we took about 8 months just kind of wrestling with it, getting comfortable with what God might be doing. And at that
Mm.
point in time, it was like we had the courage to say yes to a year.
Yeah,
And
right.
so we said
Yeah,
yes that we were going to go for a year.
yeah.
And then Global
I think if
Partners
God
had us
said it was
in.
gonna be long term, we would have said no.
Yeah, yeah. If it was 2 years, that was too hard at that time.
Yeah,
But we were in training with Global Partners, and the time between saying yes and going into training, we just shared with people that we just want to go over and serve the local church there.
yeah.
We want to be a part of
Whatever
what
they
God's doing.
need.
And
We
yep,
kept saying,
but we
"Whatever
want to
they
be a
need,
part
we'll
of what.
do."
Yeah, we want to be a part of what God's doing there,
Yeah.
and serve the local church. Well, we do a call with New Zealand leadership at the time, and they say, "Hey, listen, we're glad you're coming for a year, but we just had a conversation with the local church leadership, and they've said going forward, the best way missionaries can serve here is to stay for 2 years." And I remember we walked. It was a 5-minute walk back from where we had the call to where we were staying, and we're both kind of in tears because we just knew that okay, we're going
Well,
to be there
guess
for
we're
two
going for 2
years.
years. Yeah.
And then each time a visa renewal came up, we just didn't
Mm,
feel that God was finished with us. So now we find ourselves at 13 years
yeah.
and counting. And again, if at any point earlier God said, "Listen, you're going
Mm,
to be away from family and everyone for 13 years," we
yeah.
may not have had the
It's
courage to
hard.
do it. But
Yeah,
God gave us the increments that we
yeah,
could handle to go ahead and say yes.
yeah. And he just kept opening up the umbrella, like the church we went to go serve through Global Partners was like the avenue that got us over there. Definitely, God did some great things in that season, but he just kept opening up the umbrella and said, "Well, now it's this, and now here we are with SIM, the missionaries sending missionaries across the globe." But the heart and the understanding for mission now, compared to where I was before I left US soil, it's a whole different world. So, yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that story with us. God is faithful, and He knows
Mm.
exactly what we need, even if, I might not have the courage to answer my call right now. It's only going to be a year. Trust me.
Yeah.
It's only going to be a year.
Yeah,
That's so
yeah,
cool. I love that.
yeah.
Oh, so what was so you already mentioned that going back to just talking about how you're serving and but before we get into that, I do have just a
Mm,
quick question.
mm,
Maybe I just missed it. Some of the listeners at home might be like, "Oh, what are you talking about?"
mm,
How did you get to serving with SIM
yeah,
with Global Partners?
yeah.
Is there a big
Really,
story
That
really.
behind
that's a
that?
no, it's a good
Um,
question. Yeah.
so I'll give the summary story, and then you can dive into any part that you want to dive into.
Mm,
We served solely with the church for the first year, but
through
we weren't
Global
fully
Partners.
funded.
Yeah.
And so for about 13 months, we'd get to the 15th of the month and would see if we had enough money to go another month.
Mhm.
Global Partners really took a risk on us sending us,
Yeah, we
and
wouldn't
we
be
like we are
wasn't for them.
so thankful for them for being able to do that and think outside of the box.
Mm,
Um, at that 13-month mark, it looked like we were going to have to come home, and it really came down to the wire. That's a whole story in itself. Um, but ended up doing some work for a Christian aid and development fund called Tier Fund, which would be like in the U.S. if you combined an organization like Food for the Hungry and Compassion, that would be what
mhm,
Tier Fund was
Okay.
for New Zealand. And so I ended up doing some split work, with still, primarily with the church, but did a couple days a week with Tier Fund, and that met
and I
our funding
yeah,
gap.
yeah.
Um,
I stayed with
that
the church during that time as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that Tier Fund role, ended up turning into a full time role in about 6 months.
Mm,
They called me in where I worked with their church and major donor team, uh, and um, and so in that space, I personally became a bivocational missionary. Danae was the full time missionary with the church, and I would work at Tier Fund during the week, and then would do all my extra time as a pastor with the church.
mhm,
And then yeah, if I don't know for others. I mean, for me as a leader, I have these seasons where I just sit and I evaluate and just say, okay, is this still the same path? What do I think God's doing in this next season? And we were home, um, and I was going through that, and I just sensed that okay, that I've had a really good run with Tier Fund, but I really feel God calling me more towards the church space than towards aid and development, and so I just sensed a transition in the next year. And it was in
Mm,
that time that a friend of mine who was the previous director with SIM just said, "Hey, you should really look at my role." And I thought, well, he's my friend, so just to be polite, I need to look at the role. Um, and when I looked at what the board was looking for in the next director, for really for it's just one of those unique times that you look and you see all the different experiences that God has placed in your life, and I saw how they
mm,
prepared me for that particular role and what they were looking for,
yeah.
and put my name forward. And it was actually kind of humorous. I was one of the candidates that was put forward to it because they do a whole interview process for the director role. I was the only American, and there was a question on whether or not an American should be leading a New Zealand office. And so, my board, my second interview, my board would say wasn't an interview. It was, and they kept reminding me of that. This is not an interview, but they're asking questions to just kind of find out how I think, what I do, how I'd lead. And I'm like, this is an interview. And yeah, and they had the courage to go ahead and let me
Yeah,
lead the organization, and it's been a blessing ever
yeah.
since.
Well, and the reality is it is a multicultural, team, so,
Sure.
um, yeah, so you might see a lot of white faces up there, but we have Dutch and South African and, oh, it just goes on and on, so it's interesting,
Yeah.
and we are the only Americans on staff, but yeah, so
Yeah, we only have
loving
we
that.
only have 2 Kiwis on our staff.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Yeah. And so at that point, because SIM is a missions organization, we couldn't stay like with global partners and with SIM unless I'm sorry, unless global partners seconded us to SIM.
Mm,
But in that seasons of years that we were there prior, leadership had for SIM had pulled. I'm sorry. For global partners, had pulled out of New Zealand. Just circumstances. There was no longer a global partners director there. There was when we first went um, to New Zealand, and they're still very much working in the South Pacific, but didn't have specific positions in New Zealand or neighboring countries at that time for the islands. So we had a great leave, a great conversation with global partners. They were very supportive and shifted our funding and the way that we're sent to New Zealand through SIM instead. Um, but supporters like KCC have stayed on with us, and it's been amazing, an amazing journey. And so we still stayed involved with that church that we came to serve, did what we could for them, but shifted our work efforts, the bivocational work, to SIM. And I came on a few months after Rob did. Just felt really called to join the mission as a partner as well, and be a part of what was going on and step into that training space.
that's an amazing journey. Love
Yeah,
hearing that
Mm,
story about how God is just being faithful and directing your footsteps and bringing the right
exactly.
people into your lives at the right time.
Mhm,
And like you
mm.
mhm.
mentioned, giving you the courage to say yes to this and then yes to this. And now now it's become this and this and this. Oh, man. So we talked about, you guys are in New Zealand. I don't know much about New Zealand. I know that's where the Lord of the Rings was filmed. That's about the extent of my knowledge.
Mhm.
Well, that maybe there's a little more. So what are some of the biggest cultural differences and maybe
Mm,
barriers that you faced
mhm.
or continue to face in your
Mm.
work there?
Yeah, yeah.
Really, really good question. So let me just paint a little picture of New Zealand to set a foundation, and we can talk about some of the cultural
Please.
things that are both awesome, that I think we can learn from, and some of the things that we had to adapt to. New Zealand is a country. We're a country of about 5.2 million people, so not that large. Like I think out east where we come from, I think the population Boston is somewhere around 6 million.
Mm,
So and we're a country that would, if you superimposed it on the U.S., it would start in Maine, and it would finish up somewhere down like near Georgia.
yeah.
So it's a small country population wise. It's one of the most secular countries in the world. So
Oh,
this past census that we have almost 50% of people who would declare on their census that they have no religion whatsoever. And that's steadily increased. If you go back three censuses ago, it was at about 30%. Um,
Mhm.
and
wow.
so it's been increasing. A, um, a study was commissioned a couple of years ago that specifically dove into the church, and 16% of the population would be considered a regular church attender. A regular church attender is going once a month. Um, and if you are exceedingly active, as in doing church more than once a month, that's down below 9%.
Wow.
Uh, so the yeah, it's an interesting place to do ministry, and more you see in wider culture faith being portrayed as something that is irrelevant, or less relevant, and
Mm,
that's the space that we get to work in. At the same
mm,
time, there is a strong church history there. So only 30 years ago, New Zealand sent the most missionaries per capita of any developed country in the
Wow.
world.
Wow.
That's not the case now, but 30 years ago that was the case. Um, there's a real strong history of faith impacting decisions through different regions. So the south of the South Island, you have Scottish immigrants that came over, where they came over for religious freedom, and you have almost a Bible Belt through
Mm,
the
mhm,
South that is still quite active in supporting missions. And you have other streams. You have a really awesome testimony of how the gospel came to New Zealand, and how the indigenous people took on and embraced that gospel. So there are um, these threads as you dive into New Zealand's history that are really rich that you can go back and draw to. But current day, there's not a desire to connect with that. If anything, there's
mm,
a real significant momentum to move more and more into a secular space.
yeah.
Um, so um, so so that's the setting that we found ourselves in. The other thing that's fascinating about New Zealand is the how the country was set up. So New Zealand was set up with a treaty with the British government and the indigenous people, the Maori people, that spoke about how they would relate instead of who necessarily had right, or seceding rights to one party or the other. And
Mm,
so to this day, you have a country where indigenous people have a voice, and much of our discussion, if you follow local news and whatnot, much of our discussion tends to be on how that voice is protected,
mm,
things that could threaten that voice. But there's this foundation of saying that as immigrants coming in, we're not taking over, we're
mm.
coexisting and trying to
wow.
sort out, and that coexistence is often messy. As a
Sure.
matter of fact, with
Yeah,
the current
there's a real
political
tension
environment,
there.
it's
Yeah.
really messy. But
Mm,
it's really a fascinating cultural element to be a part of, and to see how a nation works that out.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and what I've appreciated from that as an American going over there, and knowing some of the challenges that we have with our indigenous populations here in North America, or elsewhere, and First Nations people, um, just the platform that a treaty like that gives to have some of those
mm,
discussions
Wow.
mm,
is really cool. Um, one of the things that was, I think, the most challenging for us going over there, when I go and I visit countries and I visit some of our partners, and the language is different, the living style is different. You have you have such drastic differences. It's easy to get into a space that I need to change, that this is different, and so I need to go ahead and adapt. Um, New Zealand, you go over, and there are a lot of things that look the same. We speak the same language, or British English, American English. Maybe that's another debate on whether it's the same language or not. Um, um, and so we've got common language. There are a lot of common practices. There are common cultural references, but it is different.
Mm,
New Zealand's
mm,
much more communal, than the US is. There are some different issues on directness and whatnot with people, and when you overlap two cultures and there's a lot of similarity, the differences sneak up on you,
Mhm.
mhm,
and they can be really challenging. Yet like it was foolish of us to think that we wouldn't have to culturally adapt.
mm,
That we did have to go through a cultural adjustment in New Zealand. And
mhm,
interestingly enough, now we find ourselves with a feet in both camps.
Sure.
mhm.
And so we find that when we come back to New Zealand, we have to put on that cultural adaptation lens again, and reconnect with some of our American way of thinking. And then when we transition back
Mhm.
to New Zealand, we have to adapt again on the plane and to
Yeah,
try to shift over to that New Zealand mindset.
yeah. I think one thing that I would want people to understand about New Zealand, that, that gives a great cultural picture of the church and the history and where we've gotten to. But especially, so we're in Auckland, and Auckland is a massive, they call it a super city on the North Island. So there's two islands, the North Island, the South Island. And there's cities scattered here and there, but Auckland's the largest. And we find ourselves in East Auckland. That's where the SIM offices are, but half of our staff is remote. They work from all over, and we meet on Zoom and all of that as well. But New Zealand, and especially Auckland, is a melting pot. It is that place in the world that everybody says that's where we're immigrating to.
Mm.
Like there isn't any one where we live. I feel like there isn't any one population. So East Auckland, where we are, it tends to be a high Asian population, but within that is also the South American, the Indian. Um, it just goes on, and there are people who have immigrated there, so we deal with a lot of immigrants,
Mm.
or work with a lot of immigrants, and so that flavors the church as well. But with that, you have the Pacific Islands that are drawn to New Zealand. So we're still connected with the Wesleyan Church. Rob is still he's a ordained Wesleyan minister, and we're still connected with National Church and what we do and whatnot. But within that, we have a Fijian Wesleyan Church, a Cook Islands Wesleyan Church,
Oh.
a Tongan Wesleyan Church. So you have the Pacific Islands that have also come to New Zealand, plus the Maori. So then that's the indigenous people, and the tension, a good tension that you live with every day of merging those cultures. That's one thing I love about New Zealand, is that they are embracing as best they can the treaty. So like our road signs will have the English word, but then the Maori word for whatever the name of the road is, or the
Oh,
name of the
wow.
town is, or that sort of thing. So it's quite integrated. So that's what we get to work among, which is a blessing and amazing opportunities, but also constantly learning culture in a sense. We're constantly learning culture, because you can't necessarily say this is the culture. But that's the exciting part too, I think too. So
Yeah.
mm,
That is
And
really interesting. Oh,
just
please.
I was gonna say, just one more thing to add to that, Thorn, is like what's fascinating is it's not an either or, it's a both and. So like I talked about how secular New
right.
Zealand was.
Mhm.
Mm,
Um, but because of the indigenous influence, Maori influence and whatnot, most gatherings start with a karakia, and a karakia is a
mhm,
prayer.
mhm.
Um, and 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 um, so while there's a move towards secularity of most of the culture, you also would get anyone that would question whether or not you start a meeting with a
Yeah,
karakia.
yeah, it's
Um,
interesting. Yeah,
the culture, again, like you have that culture being exceptionally secular, but we have Bible in schools,
Huh.
that people
which
can
you
go
wouldn't
in. So
see. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so and it's an opt-in program, but it's an avenue that if people want to go ahead and do that, almost do like a vacation Bible school type thing within the school system during the year. So it's this odd mix that you wouldn't think those things would go together, but they overlap and they create opportunity.
That is fascinating to me because, like you were just saying, and you said earlier how you kind of see, or maybe you saw New Zealand as in this cultural sense as being like 20 to 25 years ahead of where we are in the United States right now with the church and its relevance in society. But at the same time, it's still being at least certain aspects of the church, like the Bible and schools and prayer, still being integrated into society in a lot of ways that that's very different, and I like you said,
Mm,
I would not imagine that from what hearing, "Oh, this is a secular,
Yeah,
post-Christian
you wouldn't
culture."
think that in the secular space. Yeah.
And do you get because you said you were in Auckland, with a lot of immigrants from all around the world, do you get a lot of immigrants that, are they forming their own religious subgroups? Are a lot of them Christian, or are they kind of becoming, like, homogenized? How does that, layout kind of look?
A
mm,
little of both. So much of the growth in faith would be attributed to immigrants.
Mhm,
Census data would it leads to that conclusion, and that's not unique to Christianity.
sure,
So other world religions have been on a growth curve, um, and it would be attributed to immigrants coming in, and much of even though there's a decline in a lot of the mainstream Christian faith groups, the being able to hold numbers or to not decline quite so quick is due to immigration. I think one of the things that's fascinating is you can often talk to immigrants and immigrants leaving a country for religious freedom. They'll come thinking that New Zealand is a Christian country,
mm,
mm,
and they arrive and realize that actually their faith is more developed. Their what they're bringing with them
mhm.
faith wise is more than what they expected to receive coming to New Zealand.
Yeah. It's a little bit of that what's good for you is good for you, and so it's not necessarily tension about religion as much as, "Yeah, okay, cool, good for you,"
interesting.
kind of mentality.
One thing I've
Mm.
definitely learned recently from reading through like Operation World and just being
Mm,
around KCC, where we talk about missions a lot and the state of the church a lot, and how that this immigrants being such a push for growth in Christianity and other religions as well is such a huge thing in a lot of countries, especially in Europe, which is increasingly becoming, as I'm sure you know, more and more post-Christian, more secular, and the strongest religious groups are typically the immigrants that come from
yeah,
places like Africa and places in China, whether Christian or Muslim or something else as well.
yeah,
Well, and
exactly.
if I can, let me shift from just New Zealand to
Sure,
missions in general, because I mean, that's one of the spaces I get to lead in.
sure.
Um, in SIM, we expect that the majority of our growth in the coming years will be from the global south. So South America, Africa, Asia. Right now, over half of the 4,000 people that serve with SIM, or around half, are from North America.
Mm,
But one of the projections that I saw said that in 10 years, we expect that the majority of our people will be from the global south.
yeah.
Um, we have situations in New Zealand. So there's one church group in New Zealand that had 9 pastors come and plant churches from Kenya, and there was one church in Kenya that their mindset was, we don't need the West to come here and tell us how to disciple our people. This church, you choose to follow Christ. It's 7 years of discipleship, like intense discipleship with this church,
Wow.
and you come out and you can lead a church.
Wow.
And so they're saying, listen, actually the West needs our Kenyan missionaries. Kenya doesn't need Western missionaries to tell us how to disciple.
I read recently that there were some missionaries from China who actually came to the United States to do mission
Mhm.
work
Yeah.
in
Mhm.
California, of course. And
Mhm.
I was just like, that is so cool, and that makes me really really excited that the West, specifically like the United States and Great Britain and Europe, is no longer, or will rapidly no longer be in the next 10 years, the missions capital, the sending
Yeah.
missionaries capital. That's really exciting to me, because obviously, I mean, we're not going to get into a whole history of mission work here. Missionaries, we've done a lot of great things from the United States, but we've also brought in some problems with mission
Mhm.
mindsets and mission work as well. And like I remember reading again on global Operation World that like Singapore is becoming one of the biggest centers for sending out missions, and it's just
Mhm.
that's just really exciting to me. And and so that's really great to hear that SIM is becoming like that as well.
Mm.
Yeah. 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 It's and I think coming from, because we do come from a position of power with
Yeah.
the resources that we have and whatnot, and being careful of not drifting into arrogance when we see that change take place. Because I know in New Zealand, there was a church that partnered with the Brazilian church, and there was a church in the U.S. that was funding them and talking about the need for missionaries in New Zealand.
Mm,
And I'm part of the wider missions community, and it was really interesting because within that community, we would say that you can go from everywhere to anywhere. But the minute it became real and people started to hear that missionaries were coming to New Zealand, and
Mhm.
and that there was a church somewhere else that was celebrating that, there were voices in the missions community that kind of had this, well, we don't need missionaries to come to us, we can do that on our own here.
mm,
And the reality is, with the interconnectedness of the world today, every country has lost people. Every country has people where a cross-cultural worker would benefit, whether that cross-culture is due to ethnicity, whether it's due to lifestyle changes or differences or whatnot. That I think gone are the days that you have just countries that send missionaries and countries receive missionaries.
Mm.
We're moving into an era that every country needs missionaries, and hopefully every
Mm.
country can send missionaries, and the
Mhm.
church will be better for that.
Yeah.
absolutely. The church can only benefit from being more and more diverse, and
Mhm.
Mm,
we need more
Amen.
mission. I mean, and I'm just gonna say it. I agree with our Chinese brothers and sisters. There are plenty of places here in the States that need missionaries.
Yeah.
mhm.
Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, we have a lot more questions, but we're this sounds like this is going to be a good place to wrap it up. So, do you guys have any parting thoughts? Any last words you want to leave with our missionary with our friends from home?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
The only thing that I would say, like, I don't know about you
Mm.
today, but
Mm.
we, and this is, if you've heard us at all this week, this would be part of our mantra, and hopefully that you've heard it somewhere,
Mm.
is if you're feeling prompted into this space, and I can take it back. Whatever is on the horizon that God is nudging you or filling your mind with,
Mm.
have courage to go ahead and step into that and take a next
Mm.
step. We were at KCC when Wayne Schmidt was the senior minister there, and
Mm.
I can remember him talking one time, about, instead of praying for doors to open, that he would often walk through doors that were open.
Mm,
So this faith that if God doesn't want you moving in a direction, God will close the door.
Mm.
But instead of waiting for God to write in divine letters, this is where I want you to go, being willing to step out, and step in faith, being sort of sure, and have some courage to see what might happen. Almost like a Jonathan mindset, in the Old Testament when he attacks the camp of the Philistines,
mm,
where he says, "Well, maybe God will show up and we'll see what
yeah,
happens."
absolutely.
Mhm.
And so if you feel that God is pressing something on your heart, He's creating this holy discontent, this next step, whether it's missions, whether it's local ministry, whatever it is, step into it and take the next step. Just do something.
Mhm. Absolutely. We talked a lot about action versus inaction, and that God can work with a moving object, and it's a little bit harder to work with something sitting still. And in the world of missions, I know that we're talking that we went to New Zealand, and we're talking about missions to anywhere from anywhere and whatnot, but pay attention to what God might be doing on your heart, because being missional isn't always just the people who put feet on the ground somewhere different than where they had been. It is We cannot do what we do. Um, Missionaries in general cannot do what they do without prayer, without financial support, without having that missional mindset in the very church that you sit in. I love at KCC, one of our favorite things, matter of fact, we took a picture of it, is when you walk out the doors, there's those signs on the doors that says something about you're going out to the
You're entering
mission
the
field.
mission field.
Yes, I love that. I love that because it's local, it's your house, it's across the street, and then it is across the state, across the
Mhm.
country, and across the world. So it's that mindset of missions, and we all actually have a part in that. I mean, the Bible, that's biblical, that we are all sent in some way
Absolutely.
or form. And that's what we see at KCC, that we've been so encouraged. And I talked to Pastor Mick for a little while yesterday, that we're seeing that go across all lanes at KCC. There isn't just there's a missions pastor and a missions committee, and that the people who do missions, that's missions. It's not. It's being taught to your children. It's on the artwork in the hallways and on the signs on the doors. It obviously is coming from the pulpit up front, offering classes and opportunities just to learn more. It's just incredible to see that crossing all lanes. So we just want to encourage KCC, and we're grateful. We are grateful to all of you listening into KCC, for the faith promise that KCC and the prayer support and just support. The missions team has been incredibly supportive of us in this past year, and yeah, we're just grateful. So thank you, and we couldn't do it without your part in it as well.
Mm.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for this
Mm.
time that you've dedicated to help us understand a little bit more about you. Thank you for your faithfulness and your service as ministers of the Lord. We know that great is your reward in heaven for that. And missionaries,
Mm.
Mick says this, so I didn't come up with this. Missionaries don't get a whole lot of acclaim in the church nowadays, but I want to celebrate you guys and thank you for
Mm.
what you're doing and for the inspiration it is to me, and also hopefully to everyone who hears this podcast, everyone who meets you. So
Mm.
that is about it that we have for this
Thank
episode.
you.
Viewers from home, remember to keep Rob and Danae Reynolds in your prayers. They're heading right back to the mystical land of New Zealand soon. So continue to support them, continue to pray for them. Thank you so much
Mm.
for watching, and as always, we will see you in the next episode of The Most Segregated Hour. Bye.
Thanks,
God
Lauren.
bless.
It was great. Thank
See you.
you.